different systems in society that go from the household in different levels of aggregation, increasing levels of aggregation up to the international community. Household providing the first instance of support, protecting the vulnerable within the family, particularly the ill, the elderly, and children. Helping children especially develop the necessary capacities to address risks and opportunities in the future through education and learning. The community providing informal mechanisms to confront both idiosyncratic and systemic risks. The enterprise sector, which may allow people to pursue the positive side, the opportunity side of risk through innovation. The financial system can provide instruments like credit, saving, and insurance that can complete the toolkit of a family, of an enterprise to manage risk. The state, which can address systemic risks and can provide an enabling environment for the rest of the systems to function well, and can also protect the most vulnerable people in society. And the international community by helping especially for risks that cross boundaries, like for example, climate change. We place a lot of importance on the role of the state in this report. And as you will see, it is full of policy recommendations. And these recommendations are applied to each of the systems that I just discussed, from the household to the international community. We are, however, not naive in thinking that government can solve everything. We understand that there are government failures, and that these government failures are regrettably abundant, especially in countries that are afflicted by conflict or poor governance. We believe that civil society and the private sector, even the international community, can play a positive role, especially in those cases, by complementing what the state can do, and also by challenging governments into making them more responsive and accountable. So this is the diagram, the picture that we see for effective risk management in this holistic approach, where we have at the top people's risk management as being the goal, supported by two columns, one provided by the services and goods that the state can provide, like social protection, public goods and public policy, and by a second column, not less important, provided by civil society and the private sector. As I mentioned before, households, communities, enterprises, and the financial system playing an important role. And the international community could in fact be a support for both columns. So let me now discuss the main challenges and policies that we see for these key social systems, from the household to the international community. And I know that I will not do justice to what we have in the report. This is in fact, this area covers a very substantial part of the report, and because of time I will have to go fast. But I invite you all to read this report and pay special attention to the way that we address the contributions of these systems, and also the challenges and policies that apply to them. All right, so let me start with the household. So we argue that to help individuals manage risk well-provided and protected households are necessary. The main weakness that we see around the world is that there is insufficient risk sharing across households, especially in developing countries and especially for health and income shocks. In fact, there is a very low participation in insurance systems. Only 70% of people in developing countries have access to insurance. And let me focus, in fact, on health insurance. This graph shows the percentage of adults who personally paid for health insurance in 2011. Only in East Asia and the Pacific we have sort of respectable numbers. For all the other regions in the developing world, less than 10%, and in some cases less than 5% of adults participate in a health insurance program. So in the report we in fact advocate access to universal health insurance with means-tested premiums. This is what has happened already in Thailand and also in Turkey. In fact, let me for a moment tell you about the experience of Turkey. In 2003, they started consolidating different health insurance programs into one. What we have now is a program that covers about 95% of the population with a 76 satisfaction rate provided by those participants in the system. So in many respects, it is an example of success. Well, but we shouldn't forget that insurance has also a social component, and especially the vulnerable may not be able to participate fully, and for that we believe that the government can provide well-targeted safety nets for the poor. For effective risk management, we also need cohesive and connected communities. However, the main weakness that we see in the way that communities can contribute is that most of them are based on informal mechanisms. And informal mechanisms can be very positive for small-scale projects because they are based on trust and reciprocity. But informal mechanisms are actually very weak if projects are of a large scale, involve substantial costs, or require long-term preparation. Just to motivate this point, let me show you this photograph the efforts of a rural community in Malawi to provide clean water and sanitation. Now, this communal work is positive, and in fact, it is an improvement beyond what each of the members of the community could provide for themselves. However, this doesn't really amount to proper clean water and sanitation. For that, city planning, participation of government, infrastructure is necessary. And the same applies to other efforts that the community can undertake, from protection to for the risk of flooding to even crime and violence. We advocate, for the case of communities, a larger participation of government in the form of public infrastructure to mitigate community risks. But we believe that consultation and coordination with communities here is essential. This applies particularly to cases of conflict and fragile states. And we give this positive example in the report of Afghanistan's National Solidarity Program. This is a program, it's a new program that is building rural infrastructure in a coordination with local communities, improving not only infrastructure but also the governance capacity of these communities. And the outcomes that we see coming from this National Solidarity Program are indeed positive, and we really hope that they can be successful looking forward. For the enterprise sector, we believe that the enterprise sector can contribute to better risk management if it's vibrant, if it's flexible, but also if it's formal. The main weakness that we see in the enterprise sector, and by enterprises we don't mean large firms. We mean every activity that involves work by oneself or with others. But the main weakness that we see is that there are just too many people working on their own. We see this as a signal of insufficient risk management, insufficient risk sharing, across people within the workplace. In fact, self-employment is prevalent in many regions, not in the Middle East and Northern Africa as in others, but in Sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia, these rates can be as high as 90%. So 90% of the workforce just work on their own. And if you are on your own, you do not risk, you do not share risk, you do not share opportunities, and you cannot take advantage of the innovation that these risk-sharing arrangements can indeed provide. In the case of Egypt, self-employment in the 1990s was of the order of 40%. Currently, it's in the order of 35%. So in that regard, there has been an improvement towards better risk-sharing in the workplace. So the policy reform that we advocate for enterprises is a more propitious business environment that promotes firms' flexibility in a context of formality. We place a bigger emphasis on flexibility for the short and medium runs, but we believe that policies should aim at formality in the long run. In fact, we provide a classification of countries according to how flexible and formal their enterprise sectors are. So on the vertical axis, you have more flexibility as you go up, and on the horizontal axis, you have more formality as you go right. Egypt is located here, so it is in the middle range of formality and in the low range of flexibility. So this is an area where Egypt has much to improve. Let me now discuss the financial system. What we need from the financial system is being inclusive, but also stable. The main weakness that we see around the world is that this instability in the financial system has led to a number of systemic crises. And because of this crisis, the system has faltered in providing credit, saving, and insurance tools, the basic tools that the financial system can and should provide. This presents a map of banking crises around the world in the last 4 decades. There have been 147 banking crises in 116 countries, with an average cumulative loss in the first 3 years of the crisis of about 26% of GDP. So we can just say, we can conclude clearly that financial instability is just too prevalent. So the policy reform that we advocate for the financial system is a set of macroprudential regulations that can address systemic risk in the overall financial system. These have become more prevalent, and we can cite the examples of Korea, South Korea, and Malaysia, as well as others in Eastern Europe and in South America, as examples of to imitate. Financial strategies are an important component of a development strategy of a country. Those strategies must address the trade-offs that occur between inclusion, depth, and stability. And it's important to understand that there are trade-offs. That if you go too fast into inclusion, then you may run the risk of larger instability. And this is important and interesting for Egypt. This scatter plot shows an index of financial inclusion against national income per capita in 2011. And as probably you can see, or maybe not, Egypt is here. So it has a level of financial inclusion that is in fact very, very low, even for its level, relative to its level of income. It's one of the lowest in the MENA region, in fact only higher than Yemen. So as the country improves financial inclusion, it should keep in mind that this instability will become an issue. And then macroprudential policies will become indeed a lot more important. For the macroeconomy, we need a stable and supportive economy overall. And the main weakness that we see around the world is that many countries, especially developing countries, have suffered from a fiscal bias that exacerbates volatility. Let me explain what a fiscal bias is. It means that governments expand whenever the economy, the rest of the economy is in an upturn, and governments contract when there is a downturn. Well, that type of government activity actually leads to larger volatility. Because of that, there is a lack of proper provision of public goods and services, especially during recessions. That can lead to government shutdowns, as has happened recently in the US, and as we have seen so many times in developing countries. The policy reform that we advocate here is a counter-cyclical fiscal policy that actually looks at fiscal policy as a long-term phenomenon, accumulating enough savings during good times to be able to spend them during bad times. And it's good news that a very large fraction of countries, in fact 1/3 of developing countries now in the world, are able to conduct these counter-cyclical fiscal policies. And they have improved their stance in the last few years. This map actually compares the evolution of fiscal policy from 1960 to 99, that's the first period, and the second period is in the 2000s. And what we show here is, in different colors, whether countries have always been counter-cyclical, that's what we want, that's in dark green, they are becoming counter-cyclical, or they have always been pro-cyclical, that's bad, that's in deep red, or in pink, those are that actually used to be counter-cyclical but are now pro-cyclical. Egypt is one example of a case of a country where fiscal policy used to be pro-cyclical and then it's now becoming counter-cyclical. So this is a positive movement in the side of fiscal policy. Finally, for the international community, we need a proactive but also strategic international community. The main weakness that the international community has is that its main participants may have diverging incentives. And because of these different incentives, there is an inability to form consensus, especially on important risks that may have even catastrophic consequences, such as climate change. For that, we actually advocate that we don't wait for a global consensus to develop, but that countries, governments that have similar preferences and objectives should get together, form a coalition of the willing, and create little by little incentives for others to join in. There are interesting experiences in the past of this being successful. For instance, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed by just a handful of countries, and now it has expanded to almost all. The Montreal Protocol for the protection of the ozone layer also started with only 24 signatories, and now almost every country in the world participates in that protocol. So there are important experiences of this incremental approach to addressing global risks. Let me first. So let me. This is the coming to the last part of the presentation. We wondered then in the report how to make it so important, how to make it even more so in the development agenda. And there are 3 steps here. Number 1 is to policies that are oriented to integrated risk management. So we don't offer just one policy or one solution. There is no silver bullet in that case. But the report offers a cohesive set of policies that are applied to each system, from the household to the international community. I don't intend for you to read this table, but you can find it in the report. And we believe that these policies put together make a cohesive set. Number two is first is policies. Second is a changing approach, especially to development planning. So from planning under certainty, that is assuming that things will remain the same, to considering always change and uncertainty as fundamental characteristics of modern economies. But this changing approach, we believe, has to be institutionalized. It has to become part of the way that policies are made, policies and plans are made. And we advocate the formation of a national risk board. This is not necessarily one more layer of the bureaucracy, but actually a group that can integrate risk management, considering synergies, trade-offs, and priorities in addressing different risks in different contexts. There are interesting experiences around the world that we can cite. There are basically two models of national risk boards. A model where the National Risk Board is independent from government and has act or explain powers. That's what happens in the Netherlands and in the UK. Or the second model is to have the National Risk Board within government. This is the model followed by, for instance, Singapore, in the whole of government integrated risk framework. Many countries in the developing world are considering having a national risk board within the realm of government. In fact, the country where we just come from, Morocco, is one of the leading countries in this regard. So let me conclude now by giving you what we think are 5 policy principles. We have discussed policies, we have discussed characteristics, but even behind those policies, those institutions, and those characteristics, there must be some principles that should guide public policy as we address the best ways to manage risk. The first principle is that government should not generate uncertainty or unnecessary risks. We can quote another Greek philosopher and medical doctor, Hippocrates, who said, do no harm. This should be the first principle. The second one is to provide the right incentives for people and institutions to do their own planning and their own preparation without imposing losses or risks on others. And if we have time during the discussion, we can give you more examples, more specific examples of the application of these principles. Number 3 is to keep a long-run perspective. Long-run perspective, as we said before, is essential to manage risks, especially risks that are of large magnitude. Now, we can do this by building institutional mechanisms that go beyond political cycles. Number 4 is to promote flexibility, but not in a way that really means that the law of the jungle, but actually promote flexibility within clear and predictable institutional framework. And number 5 is the protection of the vulnerable, in a way that encourages actually self-reliance by those that are being protected, and that preserves fiscal sustainability. With these 2 principles, the vulnerable can not only be protected, but can actually get out of this situation of vulnerability. This report offers many more things, and I do invite you to visit our website. We have a variety of tools that we want to use to promote the messages of this report. We even have some animated movies that you can show your students, your friends, your children, etc. And I thank you very much. I just leave you with the question that which we started this presentation: will we be ready when crisis strikes or when opportunity knocks? And I now give the time to my colleague Kyla, ready to complete the presentation. Thank you very much.
So I will be short because we want to have a discussion with you, but what I wanted to do is just to go a little bit deeper in some of the evidence that we looked at on how different countries are preparing for risks and also the obstacles to risk management. And one of the first things that really struck us is about the number of risks that people in developing countries are facing. So this chart shows some data from household surveys, which is asking households about the number of shocks they experienced in the previous 12 months. And what we see is that a large majority of households face at least one shock, but many households face more than one shock per year. And this same data asks households about which shocks they face. And what we find is that natural disasters are the most common, especially floods and droughts, especially in rural areas. Health shocks are very common, and also employment shocks, but more in urban areas than rural areas, which probably reflects the fact that employment in rural areas is more informal. We also looked at trends in risk, both across regions and over time, and I won't go through all of the categories that we looked at, but the point that I wanted to make is that the experience is different for different kinds of risk. So, for example, for health risks, we see that the maternal mortality rate has declined in all regions. For other risks, the picture is more mixed across regions. So, for example, very deep and large recessions have become much less common in most developing countries, but actually have become more common in OECD, in the advanced economies. Similarly, for crime and violence risks, these are particularly a problem in Latin America and in sub-Saharan Africa. For other risks, the risks that have materialized have increased across all regions. So, for example, the incidence of natural disasters has increased everywhere. And this may not mean that there are more hazards, but certainly because many more people live in densely populated areas that are exposed to hazards, the number of disasters has increased. So we asked ourselves, how do people face this magnitude of risks that they encounter? And to answer that question, I just wanted to go back briefly to what Norman introduced on what we see as the components of risk management. And to make it more concrete, I'll just use an example. So the example is about the risk of malaria. So as Norman said, you start with knowledge, both information on risk, but using that information to make judgments. So you can learn about the risk of malaria and how to treat it. Then you act. So protection is the steps to reduce both the probability and the size of the losses from negative shocks, or to increase those from positive shocks. So from malaria, you can wear long sleeve clothes, use bed nets, drain standing pools of water to mitigate the risks. But because you cannot eliminate the chance of all negative shocks, insurance provides a means to transfer resources from good to bad times, or to those that are most in need in bad times. So for malaria, this may be your private health insurance. It could be informal, turning to members of your community, or even using government health services. And these three components are what we see as preparation, what you can do before a risk materializes. And then afterwards, you cope with what has happened. So you may use your savings to pay for health treatment or go to a hospital. In terms of the evidence that we looked at across developing countries, I would say that lack of knowledge has been a barrier to risk management, but it's improving in many areas. So for example, a lot more information is available on managing health risks. Also, technology can help. So, for example, after the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, people were using their mobile phones to text information on their situation, and by pooling all of that information, the responders were able to target their response to those areas most in need. Protection, the picture is probably mixed across different areas of risk, but big improvements, for example, in health with immunization and access to sanitation, in natural disasters through early warning systems, and even preparing for economic shocks through fiscal and monetary policy frameworks. Insurance, as Norman indicated, it tends to be lacking formal insurance in developing countries often, but there have been some advancements, for example, through microinsurance, and people do turn to communities as a form of informal insurance. But to the extent that these three elements are missing to some extent in different developing countries, there's